Hello, and welcome to another of my conversations with Robert Rowland Smith on good and bad therapy. Hi there, Robert.
Hi there, Mark.
Today, Robert, I thought we should tackle a subject which is often discussed and often sort of half understood, I feel, and that's the matter of narcissism. It has very much been a subject of discussion in public life. Various leading politicians are often accused of being narcissists. And I thought we could perhaps tease apart what might be being meant by that, but then also just more generally consider this question of narcissism, because in psychotherapy and psychoanalytic thought, it's not so much a problem. Sorry, it's not so much a diagnosis as a problem to deal with. And everybody has narcissistic needs. The question is how you respond to them. So I thought we could cover off the topic like that. I mean, do you want to give us a starter for 10 and say
Yeah,
where
for sure.
Freud picks it up?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So, narcissism is Freud's coinage, and Freud, being very taken up with ancient ideas, particularly Greek ideas, was inspired by the myth of Narcissus, which was made famous by Ovid, who's a Roman poet writing actually around about the time of Jesus Christ. So it's very odd sometimes to think of these commonalities. We think of kind of Christian origins and somehow Latin poetry as being very different things, but that's more or less happening at the same time. Anyway, so Ovid's most famous work is called The Metamorphoses, which is a series of tales, basically kind of myth-like tales, I suppose. Stories of gods, transforming themselves into animals, and terrible shenanigans amongst the gods and them interfering with the life of humans. And one of his stories is the story of Narcissus and Echo. But it's obviously the Narcissus part of that Freud picks up on. And just to remind people what goes on in that story, Narcissus, who's this described as a kind of beautiful youth, so a male, I guess we'd probably describe him as a teenager or something, an adolescent, is kind of wandering through the forest and stoops down to drink some water from a pool. And as he leans over the pool, he sees himself reflected back, of course. And in the myth, he falls in love with himself because he finds this, the youth he's looking at so beautiful and compelling and all the rest of it. But of course, as he goes to touch the face, the water, being water, kind of dissolves, so he can never actually achieve his dream of kind of realizing his love for this, what he thinks is the other, as we would put it in philosophy or psychoanalysis, but is in fact himself. And then Freud says, okay, so narcissism, in fact, his technical description of it is a case of the ego withdrawing its libido for objects outside itself and directing that libido towards itself. So the ego is actually Freud never used the word ego. He used the word the I, das Ich in German. The I, which is the primary function in all of us, has this thing called libido, which is a bit broader actually in Freud than what we've come to know. It's not just sex drive, it's kind of positive love, energy, for want of a better word. So the ego is more naturally inclined to attach to objects, as Freud calls them, outside itself. Initially our main love object, in Freud at least, is probably the mother. That as we grow up, we withdraw that from the mother, and then we begin to attach to, love objects, particularly when we've become adolescents. And that's a mix of, sexual and aesthetic and other kinds of attraction. But what happens, with narcissism, very shortly, is that the love for the other becomes a love for the self. And that's kind of Freud's basic definition of it. But obviously, as you know, narcissism is used very broadly these days, as you were saying, and people bandy it around. He's a narcissist. Actually, it tends to be referred to, I think, probably more to men than women, I would have thought. At least
I'll let you make that comment.
Yeah.
No, I wonder if it's just worth just saying on the myth a little more before going further into the psychoanalytic development of it, because it's such a wonderful story. I mean, maybe I can just say something about Echo,
please. Yeah.
And her role in it. She's a nymph, and when Narcissus is wandering around in the woods, so if I remember right, the fuller story is that Narcissus has gone hunting with some of his fellow mates, for a jolly jaunt, as it were, very male, in fact, and he wanders off, as the narcissistic person might, because they don't really mind what others are doing. They always assume that others will revolve around them. And in fact, you know, in the psychoanalytic literature, you get this question of whether the narcissist really knows that there are other people in the world, because libido, which attaches to others, also tells you that others exist. So if you've withdrawn all your libido and only have it focused on yourself, then it's sort of hard to know that others are really there, strangely. But anyway, so he's gone wandering off in the woods on his own, as a narcissist might, and then comes across this pool. But by the pool, living in the reeds, is this nymph, Echo. And her curse is that she can only say what other people say, you know, echoing it back. And it's an amazing mythical invocation of codependency, and why narcissistic people are actually really attractive to some other sorts. Because if they're not sure of themselves too, but in a different way, they might get drawn to the narcissist because the narcissist will give them plenty of things to say. And so sure enough, in the story, this works out because Narcissus hears Echo and says, "Who's there?" And Echo immediately goes back, "Who's there? Who's there? Who's there?" And then Narcissus says, "Show yourself." And Echo says, "Show yourself, show yourself." And this kind of mutual non-conversation takes place. And eventually, when Echo does show herself, she's sort of distraught with not being able to reach out to Narcissus. And Narcissus sees her and thinks she looks hideous and turns his back on her. And Echo disappears into the mountains, and all that remains of her is this kind of echoing sound. But it's such a brilliant myth for that kind of codependency idea as well.
Yes, it is. It is wonderful. And of course, there's also the flower that grows up by the pool, which is the narcissus flower, like a daffodil sort of thing. Yeah, no, it's wonderful. It's so rich, isn't it? There's so many echoes within it about love, interrupted love, repetition, just being able to be sort of just stuck in a kind of cycle that you can't break out of. And it's a tragedy, essentially, isn't it? Because
well, I mean, you know, it's very clear in the story that no one's happy.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the other thing about the way that the word is used now, that if someone is accused of being a narcissist, it's often thought that somehow they love themselves and they love the world, they love life. It's just that they ruin other people around them. But the secret that every narcissist carries is that actually it's a terrible existence, and that's why it gets so interesting in psychoanalysis, I guess. I mean, I could pick up on some of the post-Freudian people if that'd be useful.
Yes, let's do that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so the way, when I was doing psychotherapeutic training, the way this has sort of got developed over the decades and now centuries, you know, since Freud. We were often taught that there was a kind of like a range of ways in which this narcissistic quality can show up. And the one that's in a way the most obviously tragic is the kind of the dissolved or very fragmented, vulnerable narcissist. And that's the kind of person who you meet, and at first you just feel incredibly sorry for them. Because nothing seems to go well in life. But if you speak to them at all, you realize that the trouble is that everything that comes to them that might be good, they sort of destroy themselves. They can't believe it, they can't accept it, they think they must be at fault, there's guilt, shame, whatever. And so this is a form of narcissism that can't love yourself in a sort of adequate way or a proper way, in order to take in good things, realize that you're worthy of good things, and then be able to step back into life, and so, you know, live a good life. So that's sort of one form of narcissist. Of course, they don't get into public life because they wouldn't dream of ever, or hardly stepping out of the front door, let alone into public life. Then there's a second sort, which we talked about, which is the charming narcissist.
Mm.
And this is the person who develops a different strategy to try to get the world to love them, which is by being charming. They're the kind of person that operates, and perhaps it's just worth saying that, we all have this to a degree, and we all have this challenge of how to love ourselves correctly so that we're comfortable in our own skin, can sort of get over ourselves in order to love others. But in the pathological meaning, it's when someone organizes more or less their whole life around the failure to love themselves. And so the charming narcissist does this by trying to get others to love them, being witty, perhaps, being charming. But there's always this sense that somehow when you're on the receiving end of this, you feel a bit sort of used or a bit depleted. There's not really been a full connection or communication, because clearly sometimes being charming or witty really can be a wonderful way of bonding. But you get left feeling something else is going on here. And then, maybe over time you realize that this is a narcissistic trouble. The third sort is there's four, by the way. The third sort is the social narcissist. I'm not just stealing the whole show. Okay. In a narcissistic way. Yeah, the third is the social narcissist, who I think they're often drawn to do good works, and may well be and get involved with charities that maybe do very, very good things. But again, there's a sort of sense of disturbance underneath it, which is that this person tries to love themselves by being associated with good things, by doing generous acts, by loving others, by maybe even quite sacrificially being engaged with life. But again, you realize that underneath it, there's some deep trouble within themselves that they're trying to make up for by being identified with what's good. They essentially feel there's no good in them. And the dark side of this comes out when every so often in charities you hear of leaders of the charities or charity workers doing terrible things, taking advantage to those over those that they have responsibility for. You wonder whether that's some kind of narcissistic affliction. And then the fourth sort is the phallic narcissist, and these are perhaps the sort that most commonly get into the newspapers. And the idea of the phallic narcissist is that they try and use their power. The phallus in psychoanalysis is the object of power, as opposed to the penis, which is the object of connection. And the phallus then is sort of waved around, and in extreme cases, these people do find their ways into positions of maybe great power. And so perhaps for quite a long time, it seems like it's working for them, that they can make the world bow down to them. They can command the world and pull the levers, and it looks like the world works for them. And so it seems satisfying. But of course, either eventually the strategy fails, their career tumbles, finally people turn on them and expose them, and they're forced to resign, perhaps we could say. Or, of course, the destruction that's caused by this exercise of power is such that, again, it starts to sort of crumble and fall. And almost everybody in the world, apart from perhaps the person concerned, and maybe a few of their codependents, can see what's going on.
It's a kind of, I want to also throw in another post-Freudian, Jacques Lacan, in a second. But in a way, all of what you're describing there, all of those four aspects of narcissism are to do with the kind of failure of relationship in a way, aren't they? And certainly with others, and often with the self, whatever it is, there isn't that connection, as you described, something that's got interrupted there. And in Freud, that would be because of something that's happened perhaps in the early life. So in a way, all of those versions of narcissism are a kind of defense against relationship, because there's something about being in relationship which is troubling, difficult, stressful, even traumatic, I suppose, in some ways. So narcissism is a sort of strategy in some ways.
In psychotherapy, it's treated as a developmental failure. And the broad idea is this one, that when we're very young, we don't really have a good sense of the other. Maybe even we live in a kind of unitive existence. And so the shock of realizing that there is another, and maybe, the mother or parent, is a crisis. And with luck, we are helped to navigate through that crisis and so move on in developmental terms. But if not, you can get stuck in this effort to try and make this unitive experience restore.
Yeah.
And that is what is unpleasant in young life, but leads to all these other things in adult life.
So Jacques Lacan was I was going to say famous, but also somewhat infamous French psychoanalyst, who positions himself really in the tradition of Freud, more philosophical perhaps by nature, very influenced by Hegel, for example. So, and his writing is sort of notoriously elliptical and potentially a bit narcissistic, actually. But he kind of alludes to narcissism in his most famous concept, which is that of the mirror stage. And the theory is, it's a developmental theory again, that in very, very young life, the infant really has no idea that they are a person at all, and although they are the recipient of all sorts of things, food, touch, smell, and are centered in that kind of phenomena and in the phenomena around them, they have no means of making it cohere or make sense of it. They're simply in receipt of sensations going on around them. What happens in the mirror stage, and I think it's interesting in Lacan whether he means this literally or metaphorically, but there's kind of a moment, usually before the age of 1, where the child sees itself in the mirror and kind of goes, it's sort of an aha moment. It's like, oh, so all these feelings and sensations and experiences that I've been having all relate to a me, and there is a center, there is a kind of platform or console almost, from which I'm then responding to all these things around the world. So for Lacan's much more interested in identity probably than Freud is. I mean, I don't think Freud's particularly worried about identity at all that much. For Freud, it is about these sort of pulsional instincts and feelings and so on. But so Lacan says, this is a critical phase for the infant to go through, where they see themselves as a self, essentially, and that is a moment of integration and coherence and cognitive grasping, really, of themselves as positioned in the world. So it's kind of good narcissism in a way, because the child does what I was going to say, the Oedipus. There's a fantastic Freudian slip. That's the ultimate Freudian slip. So the child does exactly what Narcissus fails to do, which is to sort of see themselves in the mirror without the image fragmenting, and to create a sense of coherence. So this is, if you like, good narcissism as opposed to the sort of bad narcissism that we see in Freud. Because it is worth saying, people do need a sense of self, or a sense of ego. We think the word ego is almost always used pejoratively these days, but actually we do need a kind of a sense of ego in order to make sense of the world, and actually for protection. We need, in order to not be too risky in our behavior, we need to have an ego to protect, or rather the ego protects us from harm. Because whatever the ego is in Freud, it's that which wants the best for itself, even if it gets misdirected sometimes, like into masochism, for example. So Lacan, in a way, suggests that there might be a good version of narcissism.
I think that's really important, actually, because as you say, the ego, so particularly in spiritual circles, the ego is seen as the kind of bad guy. Yeah. But I always think you only have to see what it's like when people's egos are really smashed by walking onto a psychiatric ward, where the ego really has crumbled, and it's a disaster. Yeah. I think that the much more significant thing is what the ego thinks it's in service of, and if the ego thinks it's in service of itself, a bit like Freud's idea of the libido being withdrawn, that's when the disaster starts the pathology starts to take hold. But if the ego can offer itself in the service of something else, a wider life, then that's a tremendous thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it raises the question from the other side of the coin, like, how do you deal with a narcissist? You know, whether you're a psychotherapist like you, or, you know, if you find yourself in a relationship with a narcissist and you've been charmed by them, or what have you. Because in a certain sense, you know, purely speaking, you're not really anything. You know, you are simply material for their reflection, for their needs, for their self-affirmation, for their self-love, and so on. So you are kind of not just the other to them, but you're kind of radically othered. You know, you're kind of outside their sphere of comprehension in some way. And yet, of course, we know plenty of people do fall for narcissists precisely because of that, particularly the charming narcissist, but also the phallic narcissist, because of that power that they have. And people are, rightly or wrongly, of course, drawn to that. So there's a kind of, what therefore is the anti-narcissist, if you see what I mean. How would we describe that character type? Because it's somebody, in a sense, who is emptied out and allows themselves to be recruited by the narcissist for the narcissist's needs or desires or whatever.
Yeah. Well, in the psychoanalytic literature, sort of more recently, there's almost a sort of a dispute or discussion about how to treat narcissistic personality disorders, and I know we have a few psychotherapeutic students and practitioners who listen. So these are the figures of Cahute and Kernberg, and one suggests that actually what you have to do is to provide the environment within which the narcissistic person can sort of have the chance of growing up again. So you create a safe space, and in a way you say it's okay to love yourself. You can trust it, and that gradually creates the possibility of getting over yourself, of absorbing enough of this self-love in order that it feels stable, a good object inside. And then the idea is that the person moves on to more sort of other developmental stages. But that's the long, slow process of a treatment. Whereas Kernberg, he thought that actually, no, you must challenge the narcissism within a safe context, because he thought that by the time someone gets into certainly, middle or later adulthood, there's not the chance for it to things to develop naturally, and the therapist is much more likely to collude with the narcissism if they try and just provide a safe space for it. And so then it's a more confrontational kind of treatment, where in a sense what you do is say to someone, look, you're gonna hate me, you're gonna get angry with me, because I am going to challenge you, but you must promise me that you come back and we'll talk about that. So you don't just provoke, but you try, as the therapist, artfully to show the person, in a way, provide a mirror again, but where they can begin to see something of themselves, and then start to see something of others.
I was going to talk about that mirror metaphor as well, because I do a lot of coaching work, executive coaching, and of course, there are narcissists in that world as there are in others. And I think there is a variation on that second form of that second way of dealing with narcissists, a variation on the kind of challenging approach, which is to do with transference and countertransference and so on, which maybe we should talk about in another episode. But what I found quite helpful is simply to play back to the coachee, the client, the analysand, the effect they're having on you, the coach, the therapist, in the moment. So it's not challenging in the sense that, I think maybe there are some narcissistic traits here. You're not making any statements or theories or interventions or interpretations, but you might say something like, when I hear you say that, it makes me feel flattered but excluded, or I can't help feeling you're trying to seduce me and I don't like that feeling, or words to that effect. So it's mirroring, not in the sense of a description of them. It's actually a mirroring in the sense of the coach or therapist showing in a mirror their own feelings back to the client. And I've certainly had some success with that with clients, because there's no attribution in that, there's no blame, and it can cause a kind of jolt. It's like, oh, you feel you feel seduced, do you? Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I'm awfully sorry. And it's quite interesting how rapidly they'll move to the, oh, if I knew that, I wouldn't have done it. You know, so the lack of self-awareness is suddenly exposed, but the desire to correct is often, you know, it comes immediately afterwards. It's quite interesting. You know,
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, actually. So to show the defense, which is completely unconscious. But you know, if I guess if someone is functioning in the world, there's a good chance they'll have enough of good ego functioning to be able to pick up on that reflection back and not be kind of too devastated by it, and so work with it. Yeah, no, I mean, the other thing which sometimes I've said to people is to hold boundaries. And you try and do it in a kind of open and compassionate way, of course, not just say, you know, stop, but say, look, I won't do what you ask now because I need to attend to myself. And again, that sort of slight reflection, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, you know, I'm sorry. But having to be quite firm about the boundaries, because the other thing about a boundary is that for the narcissistic person, it might actually help contain them. I mean, of course, another way of putting it is that with certainly the more pathological forms of narcissism, they can't contain themselves. They as it were, sort of spill out into the whole world. And so saying, learning to be able to say no can actually be very helpful. And but it's you know, it's often not very easy to do this.
No.
You can feel quite cruel, actually, and because of course, in a way, the narcissistic person does think that you're being cruel, and you get that. We will pick up on transference and countertransference for sure, and you feel that in the countertransference.
Well, yes, of course, it's cruel because in a sense you are depriving love from them, and that's what you're doing. I wonder if there's another. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, I think perhaps I'm improvising here. I haven't really thought this through, but it just came to me as you were speaking that I think there is something in the narcissistic personality which is about fantasy and living in a world which is a bit of their own construction. So they'll have lots of theories, sometimes slightly paranoid theories, which they will indulge, you know, and so doesn't like me, or they won't take any blame or whatever. So they'll weave stories around how the world is. And obviously, if we think of the big narcissists we're aware of in public life at the moment, you know, in this country and abroad, you often get that, you know, they will create a narrative, which is the purpose of which is to restore or to establish their importance in the world, essentially. And it made me think that one of the most helpful techniques that I've been taught in my coaching work in particular, but more broadly, is to challenge people just to stick to facts rather than interpretations. So instead of, you know, the world's against me or whatever the claim might be, or it's all their fault, or I did nothing wrong, the challenge is simply to say what actually happened, you know, and at an even more granular level, to really try and weed out adjectives. Because I think, and again, I really am improvising here, but I wouldn't be surprised if narcissists are particularly prone to embellishing their accounts with lots of adjective and metaphor or whatever. But the challenge to say what actually happened, what are the facts, is a kind of disarming, obviously a disarming thing to say, but can also be quite grounding.
No, I mean, well, your observation there about language makes a lot of sense, because I think part of the confusion around narcissism is it can be very attractive. You can feel sort of energized and like the world's that bit more vivid or something.
Yes.
And maybe that use of language is part of that. I mean, it also reminded me when you were talking about story and narrative and fantasies, I think this is part of the anxiety around social media and the increasingly sort of intimate, or if not invasive, ways that technology shapes our lives. Because, of course, what technology does, what artificial intelligence does, is reflect back to us what we've already told it, but maybe smartened up a bit, touched up a bit, you know, linked together to create something that's more appealing. And in a way, that is a sort of narcissistic engine. it's like going back to where you began with Narcissus staring in the pool, but the pool has got a sort of embedded capacity to tease Narcissus almost, and to draw him in that bit more. And so I do understand some of the concern around AI linked into social media, that, and as you put it, it can spin fantastic narratives, no doubt throwing in literal or metaphorical adjectives that can hook people in. And, you know, certainly people that already have narcissistic trouble, that might be very enticing, but very damaging. And who knows, perhaps even at a social level, society level, you know, maybe one of the things we're challenged with in the modern world is that our story of ourselves, progress, consumption, you know, happiness and health and so on, just keep coming towards us. As that gets challenged, a huge temptation to try and prop it up, and turning to technology to deliver that promise. Feels like it's a big part of what we're facing now as well. I'm just riffing as you know, as well, but
yeah,
maybe there's some truth in that.
No, absolutely. And it makes me think of the kind of practices around social media, particularly I was thinking of Instagram and TikTok. I was driving through London a couple of weeks ago, and there was terrible traffic, and I was stuck in a jam. It was on the King's Road in West London, and I turned to see this woman who was with her, I assume was her boyfriend, and he was just sort of waiting. They were outside a restaurant, and he was just waiting as she took and retook and retook and retook photos or possibly videos of herself, you know, and then was checking them. You could see she was obviously adjusting the filters and all the rest of it. Now, my assumption was, you know, she was doing that in order to post something on Instagram or TikTok, you know, about herself. But she was, you know, dressed to the nines, coiffed perfectly. You know, the makeup was completely, you know, on point. And what struck me about it was the sheer, you know, it was a narcissistic practice, because there she was, you know, designing an image to put out into the world. But what struck me about it was the sheer labor involved in that and the joylessness of it. So as she was smiling for the camera, you know, she would light up and all the rest of it. But the moment the shot was taken, she would be sort of tense and irritable. It's like, you know, why isn't it like that? And unhappy, really. And meanwhile, you know, the boyfriend is literally just sort of waiting for her to do that. It went on and on and on. I mean, and I was stuck in the traffic. And that, so there's an aspect, you know, if that's narcissism, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if it is, and social media obviously promotes that and encourages it, it's hard work for the narcissist. You know what I mean? It's draining. And there is this highly performative aspect to it as well. You've got to be on stage and then worry about your performance all the time. I thought, gosh, you know.
Yeah, well, look, maybe that's a good point to draw to a close on, because again, it takes us back to one of the earlier remarks that, you know, self-love is not a bad thing. It is a question of what end that self-love is serving. Is it love of others? Is it love of self? And it's often in the quality of someone's presence that you begin to sense that something's not quite right. And again, that sort of labored, you know, distrusting, anxious kind of quality that underlies an otherwise seemingly sort of loving person. You know, you may start to wonder in that case. But thanks very much indeed. Look, we made a note of transference and countertransference, so perhaps that can be a next discussion when we get to again.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, very good to see you, Mark. And yeah, until the next time.